This is HOA land. Keep pouring.
You just made a massive mistake.
Concrete trucks were already pouring a new HOA maintenance pad on my inherited land before the sun cleared the tree line. Karen Whitmore stood beside the forms in a white blazer, telling the crew to keep working because the neighborhood had permanent rights over everything inside the fence. My 1,500 acres sat under their streets, their clubhouse, their front entrance, and now their unauthorized construction project. If that lease failed, every common road, utility trench, and community facility in Briar Ridge became a legal problem overnight. What Karen did not know was that I controlled the ground lease, the renewal terms, and the access easements beneath the entire HOA. Then the concrete chute swung over the property line. Wet cement slapped into the wooden form with a heavy splash. The smell of lime, diesel, and torn soil hit me all at once. I stood at the edge of the site with my grandfather's survey packet tucked under one arm, watching gray concrete spread across land my family had owned since before half these houses existed. That was their first mistake. They thought inheritance meant paperwork. They forgot inheritance can also mean leverage. My name is Ethan Mercer. I am 43 years old, and 2 weeks ago I buried my grandfather on a hill overlooking this valley. He left me 1,500 acres of pasture, timber, creek bottom, and old service roads just outside Asheville, North Carolina. Most of it looked quiet. Split rail fences, long grass moving in the wind, red clay stuck to your boots after rain. But tucked along the eastern edge sat Briar Ridge Estates, a polished HOA community with stone pillars, matching mailboxes, and a clubhouse big enough for wedding receptions. I had driven past it 100 times as a kid. Grandpa always called it the leased land. I thought he meant some forgotten corner near the creek. He did not. The first clue came when the county clerk handed me the parcel map. She tapped the screen with one red fingernail and said, "You know the subdivision is still inside your boundary, right?" The room went quiet around me. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I stared at the map while blue parcel lines wrapped around Briar Ridge. Like a noose. Streets. Retention pond. Clubhouse. Tennis courts. Entrance road. All of it sat inside the land I had just inherited. At first, I assumed the county layer was outdated. Then my attorney pulled the old ground lease. 37 pages. Yellowed edges. My grandfather's signature on page 1. The HOA's original developer on page 2. A rent schedule from another lifetime. One clause circled in faded pencil. Market adjustment upon renewal failure. That phrase stayed with me. So did the amount they were paying. Less than some people spend on coffee in a month. By the time I reached the construction site that morning, Karen had already decided I was a nuisance. She did not ask who authorized the work. She did not ask why I was there. She looked at my muddy boots, my work jacket, and the survey packet under my arm. Then she smiled like she had already won. "This is HOA common property," she said. "You are trespassing on an approved improvement project." Behind her, the crew kept pouring. Rebar disappeared under wet concrete. A skid steer beeped in reverse. The foreman avoided eye contact. That bothered me. People avoid eye contact when they know a job has questions attached. I stepped closer to the form boards. A bright orange stake marked the edge of the proposed pad. It had been driven 6 feet past the lease exhibit boundary. Not near it. Past it. Karen followed my eyes and tightened her grip on her clipboard. "Do not interfere with community infrastructure," she said. The concrete kept spreading. The lease packet felt heavier under my arm. This was not a landscaping dispute anymore. Karen's smile never moved. The concrete truck rumbled behind her. Diesel fumes drifted across the site, while workers pretended not to listen. I pulled the folded survey from beneath my arm and opened it across the hood of my truck. The paper snapped in the morning breeze. Several crew members glanced over. One of them stopped shoveling. That caught my attention. Karen walked closer and looked down at the map. "That does not change anything," she said. Her voice stayed calm, but she did not sound as confident as before. I pointed to the highlighted boundary line. The orange construction stake sat well beyond it. The foreman followed my finger. Then he looked away. Another clue. Someone here already knew there was a problem. The concrete mixer continued turning. Wet gray slurry slid down the chute. A sharp metallic clank echoed from the forms. Karen folded her arms. "This project was approved months ago." I nodded slowly. "Approved by who?" For the first time, She hesitated. Only for a second. But I saw it. The silence around us felt heavier. A resident walking her dog slowed down near the sidewalk. Then another resident stopped beside her. People noticed tension, especially in neighborhoods where nothing exciting usually happens. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed near the edge of the construction area. Karen noticed them too. She immediately shifted into presentation mode. "This is simply routine maintenance," she announced. "Everything is perfectly legal." The word legal hung in the air. I opened the lease packet and removed a photocopy of the site exhibit attached decades earlier. The paper smelled faintly of old storage boxes and dust. I laid it beside the survey. The two maps lined up almost perfectly. Several residents stepped closer. One older man adjusted his glasses. "Wait," he said. "That clubhouse parcel is leased?" Karen's jaw tightened. There it was. Another crack. She answered too quickly. "That agreement is ancient. It has no relevance today." The older man did not look convinced. Neither did the others. A pickup truck pulled into the parking lot beside the clubhouse. The county surveyor climbed out carrying a long tube under one arm. I recognized him immediately. Mark Reynolds. He had completed the updated boundary review 3 days earlier. His boots crunched across the gravel. Karen's expression changed the moment she saw him. Not fear. Not yet. But concern. Mark stopped beside me and removed several rolled maps from the tube. Fresh survey sheets. Bright ink. Clear measurements. Official seals. He spread them across the truck hood. Wind lifted one corner before he pinned it down. "Morning, Ethan," he said. Then he looked directly at Karen. "Morning." Nobody spoke for a few seconds. The only sound came from the mixer truck and distant lawn equipment near the clubhouse. Mark tapped the survey. The construction footprint extends beyond the lease exhibit boundary. The crowd grew quiet. A woman near the sidewalk lowered her phone and stepped closer. Karen stared at the maps. Her grip tightened on the clipboard. "That cannot be right." Mark did not argue. He simply pointed to the coordinates. The numbers spoke for themselves. Residents began whispering. Questions spread through the crowd. One question appeared again and again. If the construction sat outside the lease boundary, what else did too? Then Mark unrolled one final document, and every conversation stopped. The final document slid across the truck hood and stopped beneath Mark's hand. Nobody spoke. Even the concrete crew had stopped pretending not to watch. The mixer still turned behind us. Metal rattled softly. Diesel fumes drifted through the cool air. Mark tapped the page once. "This is the updated lease exhibit review." Karen stared at it. The crowd leaned closer. I could hear the creak beyond the trees and the distant hum of lawn equipment from another section of the neighborhood. Then Mark pointed to a shaded section on the map. The silence broke immediately. The new maintenance pad was not the only problem. Several improvements already built by the HOA extended beyond the lease boundary. A storage shed, part of a parking area, a drainage structure near the clubhouse. The older resident removed his glasses and looked again. "Those have been there for years." Mark nodded. "They have." Karen stepped forward. "That does not mean anything." But her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. A woman near the sidewalk folded her arms. "Then why were we never told?" That question landed hard. More residents had gathered now. People coming back from errands slowed their cars and parked. Others walked over from nearby homes. Every few minutes another person joined the crowd. The construction project no longer held their attention. The documents did. I watched Karen carefully. She kept glancing toward the clubhouse, toward the office, toward the place where years of HOA records were stored. That caught my attention. Mini hook. Mark rolled part of the survey closed and pointed to another notation. "There is something else." The crowd quieted again. He showed a reference number printed along the bottom margin. County Archive Record. I recognized it immediately. The same archive series my attorney had mentioned. Karen looked away. The older resident noticed. So did several others. Questions spread through the crowd like a brush fire. Who approved the improvements? Were permits issued correctly? Did the board know? Nobody had answers yet. But people had started asking the right questions. The concrete foreman finally walked over. His boots left wet prints across the gravel. He looked uncomfortable. Karen told us the site was fully cleared. Karen shot him a look sharp enough to stop further conversation. He immediately fell silent. Another clue. Another crack. I opened the lease packet again and flipped to the payment schedule. The paper rustled in the wind. The numbers seemed almost unreal. Decades-old rates. No modern adjustment. No meaningful review. A resident beside me stared at the page. That cannot be what we pay. I looked at him. It is. His expression changed instantly. Concern replaced curiosity. Others began asking to see the document. Karen stepped forward quickly. Those numbers are being taken out of context. Nobody responded. The crowd was reading now. Once people start reading, control becomes difficult. A delivery truck entered the neighborhood and slowed beside the gathering. Even the driver looked interested. Mark turned another page inside the survey packet. A handwritten note sat near the bottom. Not recent. Not from me. Not from my attorney. Decades old. 3 words. Renewal review required. The older resident read it aloud. Several people exchanged looks. Karen closed her clipboard. That small action told me more than any speech could. She wanted this conversation over. The residents did not. One woman asked for the date attached to the note. Mark checked the archive reference. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. That reaction alone made my stomach tighten. The date was far older than anyone expected. Mark looked up from the survey packet. The crowd waited. Even the construction crew had stopped moving. The only sound came from the concrete mixer turning slowly behind us. The note is dated 17 years ago, Mark said. A low murmur rolled through the residence. 17 years. The older man removed his glasses again and rubbed his forehead. That was before Karen became president. Karen immediately seized on that detail. Exactly. Her voice returned with a little confidence. Whatever happened then has nothing to do with this board. A few residents nodded. Others did not. Mark kept reading. His finger followed a line near the bottom of the document. Then he stopped. Another pause. Another hook. There is a second notation. The crowd quieted again. Wind pushed across the construction site. A loose sheet rattled against my truck. Mark read the sentence aloud. Renewal review deferred pending board action. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Karen crossed her arms tighter. The older resident frowned. Deferred. Mark nodded. That is what it says. Questions immediately followed. Deferred by whom? For how long? Why was it never completed? The answers were not on the page. But the document confirmed something important. Someone knew a review was required. Someone chose not to finish it. That changed the conversation. Residents were no longer debating whether the lease existed. They were asking why critical steps had never happened. Karen shifted her attention toward me. You are creating panic over paperwork. I looked at the maps spread across the truck hood. The paperwork created the panic. Several residents exchanged looks. One woman quietly laughed. Karen did not. The concrete foreman approached again. He seemed uncomfortable standing there. Do you want us to stop work until this gets sorted out? He asked. Karen answered before anyone else could. No. The response came too quickly. The foreman glanced toward the survey maps. Then toward me. Then toward the crowd. He looked trapped between common sense and a paying client. Mark rolled up one of the maps and tapped the construction pad with the end of the tube. If this were my project, I would pause until ownership. Questions are clarified. Another crack. Another small shift. Residents heard that. Karen heard it too. The pressure continued building. I opened the lease packet again and turned several pages deeper. The smell of old paper drifted upward. A folded attachment slipped loose and landed on the truck hood. I almost missed it. Almost. The paper looked older than the rest. Different ink. Different typeface. My attorney had not mentioned it. Neither had Mark. The older resident leaned closer. What is that? I unfolded the sheet carefully. Several staples had rusted through the corners. Across the top sat a heading. Amendment proposal. The crowd immediately pressed closer. Karen's expression changed. This time I saw genuine concern. The proposal referenced a future rent adjustment mechanism tied to market conditions. Not automatic. Not approved. Proposed. But attached to the same lease file. Mark stared at it. I have never seen this copy. Neither had I. A resident near the sidewalk pulled out a phone and began taking pictures. Others followed. Karen stepped forward. That document was never adopted. Maybe she was right. Maybe she was not. But her reaction revealed something important. She knew what it was. The crowd noticed that too. The questions came faster now. Had previous boards seen it? Had attorneys reviewed it? Why had residents never heard about it? Nobody seemed satisfied with the answers. The sun climbed higher above the trees. Heat began rising from the fresh concrete. Diesel fumes mixed with the smell of wet cement. Yet nobody left. The construction project had become secondary. The lease had become the story. Then Mark looked at the amendment proposal one more time and noticed a handwritten reference number in the corner. His eyes narrowed immediately. That number led somewhere. Mark kept staring at the handwritten reference number. The crowd waited. A warm breeze moved across the construction site and rattled the survey sheets. Somewhere near the clubhouse, a flag rope tapped rhythmically against a metal pole. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. Mark pulled out his phone and entered the number into the county archive database. Residents. Watched over his shoulder. Karen looked toward the clubhouse again. That detail did not escape anyone. A loading truck rolled slowly through the neighborhood entrance and then stopped when the driver noticed the crowd. Even people passing by could tell something unusual was happening. Mark refreshed the screen. Then he did it again. His eyebrows lifted. There is a linked record. The crowd immediately moved closer. Karen spoke before anyone could ask another question. Old records do not change current operations. Her voice sounded firm, but it carried less authority than before. Too many questions were hanging in the air now. Mark opened the linked file. A scanned document appeared on the screen. The image quality was poor. The text looked faded. He enlarged it, then enlarged it again. The older resident leaned closer. What is it? Mark did not answer immediately. That pause pulled everyone in. Finally, he rotated the screen toward us. The document was a memorandum between the original developer and the first HOA board. Dated 16 years ago. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. One paragraph had been highlighted by someone years earlier. I read it twice. Then a third time. The memorandum referenced concerns about future rent adjustments if required reviews were ignored. The crowd became silent. Completely silent. Karen's expression hardened. A resident near the sidewalk folded her arms. Another resident quietly shook his head. Nobody seemed focused on the construction project anymore. The entire conversation had shifted. The older resident pointed at the highlighted paragraph. Does this mean they knew? Nobody answered right away. Mark looked carefully through the document. It means concerns were documented. That was enough. Questions exploded across the crowd. Who received the memorandum? Did later boards see it? Was legal counsel involved? Were homeowners ever informed? The questions came faster than anyone could answer them. Karen raised her voice. This community has operated successfully for years. A few residents nodded. Many did not. One woman spoke up from the back. That is not what we are asking. More heads turned toward Karen. The dynamic had changed. Earlier, she controlled the conversation. Now she was reacting to it. I watched her carefully. She seemed less concerned about me than about the documents themselves. That observation stayed with me. Another hook. Mark continued scrolling through archive references connected to the memorandum. Several were routine. Meeting schedules, correspondence, filing receipts. Then one entry stood out. Missing attachment. Mark read it twice. I noticed immediately. Missing attachment? I asked. He nodded. That is what it says. The crowd quieted again. Missing attachments create curiosity. Missing attachments inside legal records create concern. A resident pulled out a notebook and started writing things down. Another began recording video. Karen saw both actions and looked increasingly uncomfortable. The county archive entry showed that an additional document once accompanied the memorandum but was no longer included in the digital record. Nobody knew what it contained. Nobody knew why it was missing. But everyone wanted to know. The construction foreman finally approached me. Should we hold off until this gets sorted out? He asked quietly. Before I could answer, Karen stepped forward. Then she stopped. For the first time all morning, she seemed unsure what to say. The crowd noticed. So did I. Mark refreshed the archive page one more time. A secondary storage reference suddenly appeared beneath the missing attachment notice. His eyes narrowed instantly. The missing file might still exist somewhere. Mark tapped the new storage reference on his screen. The crowd leaned in again. Heat shimmered above the fresh concrete. A lawn sprinkler somewhere near the clubhouse clicked steadily as it rotated. Nobody seemed interested in going home. The construction site had become a live investigation. This reference points to physical archive storage, Mark said. The older resident frowned. Physical? Mark nodded. Not everything was digitized. That answer immediately changed the mood. A missing attachment hidden inside a warehouse box felt very different from a file lost in a computer system. Residents exchanged looks. Karen said nothing. That silence stood out. She had challenged nearly every document so far. Now she was quiet. Another hook. I watched her carefully. Her eyes moved toward the clubhouse office again, then toward her phone, then back to the crowd. She looked like someone calculating. Mark continued reading. The archive note included a retrieval date from years earlier. Someone had requested the file. Someone had viewed it. Then it disappeared back into storage. Who requested it? A resident asked. Mark searched for another moment. The record does not show here. More murmurs spread through the crowd. The older resident shook his head. Convenient. A few people quietly agreed. Karen finally stepped forward. This is turning into speculation. Her voice was stronger now, more controlled. Nobody knows what the attachment says. Technically, she was right. But nobody missed the fact that she wanted the discussion to stop before the document was found. The crowd sensed it. The pressure continued building. A woman near the sidewalk raised her phone. Can the archive retrieve it? Mark nodded. Usually. Not always. Another small uncertainty. Another reason for people to stay invested. I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. He answered after 2 rings. Gravel crunched beneath my boots while I stepped away from the crowd. I explained what had happened. The lease. The survey. The memorandum. The missing attachment. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. Do not focus only on the attachment. I stopped walking. Why? Papers rustled on his end of the line. Because the lease itself may already contain everything you need. I looked back toward the crowd. Explain. His answer came quickly. Check the renewal section again. Specifically the review deadlines. I thanked him and ended the call. The lease packet was still sitting on the hood of my truck. Wind lifted several pages. I flipped directly to the renewal language. Residents noticed and moved closer again. The older resident adjusted his glasses. Mark stepped beside me. Even Karen watched. I found the section my attorney referenced. Several paragraphs. Dense legal language. But one sentence stood out immediately. A review was required at specific intervals. Not optional. Required. The review schedule stretched across decades. I checked the dates, then checked them again. Mark leaned over my shoulder. His expression changed first, then mine. The required review dates had passed long ago. Multiple times. The crowd watched us carefully. They knew something had shifted. The older resident pointed toward the page. What is it? Before I could answer, Mark quietly counted through the listed review years. One after another. His finger moved down the page, then stopped. There should have been several reviews. The crowd became silent. Karen's face tightened. Another resident asked the obvious question. Were they completed? Nobody could answer that yet. We had evidence that reviews were required. We had evidence that concerns existed. But proof of what actually happened remained missing. The pieces were starting to connect. Not fully. Not yet. The sun sat higher now. The smell of curing concrete lingered across the site. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang noon. Then Karen's phone buzzed, and her reaction changed everything. Karen glanced at her phone, and all the color seemed to drain from her face. It lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. Neither did the older resident standing beside me. He followed her eyes and immediately noticed the change. Karen locked her screen and slipped the phone into her pocket. We are done here, she said. Nobody moved. The crowd had grown too large, and the questions had become too serious. A few residents actually laughed when she suggested ending the discussion. The sound was not cruel. It was disbelief. She no longer controlled the room. Or in this case, the construction site. A woman near the sidewalk folded her arms. What was on the phone? Karen ignored her. Another resident asked about the missing reviews. Someone else asked about the memorandum. A third person wanted to know who had requested the archive file years earlier. The questions came from every direction. Karen responded with the same phrase. The board will review everything. But that answer no longer satisfied anyone. The smell of wet concrete lingered in the warm afternoon air. The construction crew had completely stopped working now. One worker sat on an overturned bucket watching the conversation unfold. Another leaned against a truck and checked his watch. Nobody expected to be there this long. Mark opened the lease again. He pointed to the review schedule. The dates stared back at us. Required reviews. Multiple deadlines. Multiple opportunities to address the agreement. The crowd saw them clearly now. How many were missed? Someone asked. Mark counted carefully. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then more. The number surprised even him. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Karen interrupted immediately. Missing a review does not automatically mean anything changed. Technically, she was right. But that was not the issue anymore. The issue was whether people knew, whether warnings existed, whether opportunities had been ignored. Residents understood the difference. Another hook. The older resident stepped closer to Karen. When did you first learn about the lease? The question landed hard. She answered quickly. Too quickly. Years ago. Several people exchanged looks. A few seconds later, she seemed to realize what she had admitted. Silence followed. The crowd noticed. I noticed. Mark noticed. The older resident asked another question. Then why were homeowners never informed? Karen looked toward the clubhouse again. That building had become her escape route. Every time pressure increased, her eyes drifted there. The answer never came. Instead, her phone buzzed again. This time the sound was loud enough for several people to hear. She checked the screen. Her expression tightened immediately. Then she walked a few steps away and answered the call. Nobody could hear the conversation, but everyone could see it. She spoke quickly. She listened. She turned toward the clubhouse. Then she looked back toward the crowd. Her shoulders stiffened. The call ended less than a minute later. When she returned, her confidence had changed. Not restored. Reduced. Mark quietly leaned toward me. Someone from the board is probably coming. That made sense. News spreads fast. Inside HOA communities. Especially when residents start gathering around legal documents. 10 minutes later, a black SUV entered through the neighborhood gate. The vehicle moved slowly toward us. Several residents turned to watch. The tires crunched across the gravel. The SUV stopped beside the clubhouse parking lot. A man in his 60s stepped out carrying a worn leather briefcase. I had never seen him before. Karen had. The moment she saw him, her reaction told me everything. She was not happy he had arrived. The older resident recognized him too. That is Richard Hale, he said quietly. He was on the original board. Suddenly, every conversation stopped. Richard looked at the crowd, then at the lease documents, then at Karen. Finally, his eyes settled on me. He lifted the old briefcase slightly and said 6 words nobody expected to hear. I think you need this file. Richard Hale held the worn leather briefcase against his side and walked toward my truck. The crowd parted without anyone asking them to. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes. The afternoon sun reflected off parked cars and the clubhouse windows. Karen stood perfectly still. That alone told me this was not a person she wanted involved. Richard stopped beside the survey maps and looked at the construction site. The concrete had already begun curing. Workers remained scattered around the area, watching instead of working. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Richard placed the briefcase on the hood of my truck. The old leather looked faded and cracked. Metal latches clicked as he opened it. The sound seemed unusually loud. Everyone leaned closer. Inside sat folders, envelopes, and several binders filled with documents. The smell of old paper drifted upward. Richard looked at Karen before speaking. I kept copies. The crowd became silent. Completely silent. Karen immediately shook her head. Richard, this is not necessary. He ignored her. Another hook. Richard removed a thick folder and placed it beside the lease packet. His hands moved carefully, deliberately, like someone who had waited years for the right moment. The older resident recognized the folder first. Board records. Richard nodded. Original board records. Several people exchanged stunned looks. Mark stepped closer. So did I. Richard opened the folder. Inside were meeting notes, correspondence, and memorandums dating back nearly 2 decades. Many carried signatures. Some contained handwritten annotations. Others included references matching the documents we had already found. The puzzle pieces were beginning to connect. Richard turned several pages and stopped. Start here. He slid one document toward us. The heading immediately caught my attention. Lease review discussion. Dated 15 years ago. Residents moved closer again. Even people standing 20 feet away were trying to read over shoulders. Richard pointed to a paragraph near the middle of the page. Read that section. I did. Then I read it again. The document summarized concerns discussed during a board meeting. Concerns about future rent exposure. Concerns about review requirements. Concerns about potential financial consequences if deadlines continued to be ignored. The older resident slowly removed his glasses. They knew. Richard did not answer immediately. Then he nodded once. The crowd reacted instantly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just dozens of quiet conversations starting at the same time. That sound carried its own weight. Karen stepped forward. That discussion never resulted in action. Richard looked directly at her. That was the problem. Another crack. Another shift. The momentum had changed again. Mark carefully examined the meeting notes. Then he stopped at a page near the back. His finger tapped a handwritten notation. What is this? Richard glanced down. Follow-up recommendation. Mark looked up. Was it completed? Richard exhaled slowly. No. Several residents looked stunned. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another resident immediately asked why. Richard pointed toward another document inside the folder. A recommendation had been made. A review had been proposed. Professional consultation had been suggested. None of it moved forward. The records showed discussions. The records showed awareness. The records showed concern. What they did not show was meaningful action. Karen folded her arms. Her usual confidence had almost disappeared. The older resident noticed another page tucked behind the meeting notes. He carefully pulled it free. The paper was yellow with age. A staple hung loose from one corner. Across the top sat a familiar archive reference number. The same numbering sequence connected to the missing attachment. Mark's eyes widened immediately. Richard saw the reaction. So did I? The crowd sensed something important had surfaced. Richard looked down at the page and became unusually quiet. Then he said something that made every conversation stop. I thought that document was gone forever. Richard carefully lifted the yellowed document from the folder and placed it on the hood of my truck. Nobody spoke. The afternoon breeze fluttered the corner of the page. The smell of warm concrete and fresh-cut grass drifted through the air. Every resident standing there seemed to understand that something important was about to surface. Richard adjusted his glasses and stared at the document for several seconds before speaking. I remember this meeting. That sentence alone pulled everyone closer. Mark leaned over the page. I did the same. The archive reference number matched the sequence connected to the missing attachment. The same one we had been chasing all morning. Karen remained silent. That silence was becoming a story of its own. Richard opened the document. Inside was a summary prepared after a special board meeting held nearly 15 years earlier. Several names appeared across the top. Original board members, legal consultants, community representatives. The room around us seemed to disappear as people focused on the paper. Then Richard pointed toward a paragraph highlighted in faded yellow marker. Read this section. I followed the line slowly. The document described a formal review of the ground lease. Not a discussion, not a suggestion, a completed review. My eyes moved to the next sentence. The review warned that the lease rate was significantly below market value and recommended immediate negotiations with the landowner's family. The crowd reacted instantly. Conversations erupted around us. Some residents looked shocked. Others looked angry. The older resident simply stared at the page. So they knew. Richard nodded. At least some of them did. Another hook settled over the crowd. If a review had actually been completed, why had everyone spent years acting as if no review existed? Mark continued reading. His finger stopped on another paragraph. There is more. The noise around us faded again. The report recommended creating a reserve fund specifically to prepare for future lease adjustments. Several residents exchanged confused looks. One woman pulled out her phone and opened old HOA budget reports. Another resident asked the obvious question. Did the reserve fund ever happen? Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened another folder from the briefcase. The sound of paper sliding against paper seemed unusually loud. He found several financial summaries and handed them to Mark. Mark scanned the pages. Then he shook his head. I do not see one. A ripple moved through the crowd. Questions started flying again. Where did the recommendation go? Why was it ignored? Who made that decision? Karen finally stepped forward. Those recommendations were never binding. Her voice was steady, but the residents no longer accepted simple explanations. The older resident pointed toward the report. Then why keep it hidden? Karen did not answer. The silence afterward felt heavier than any response. Mark turned another page inside the report. His expression changed immediately. I noticed it before he spoke. Another clue. Another piece. He pointed toward a handwritten note attached near the bottom margin. The note referenced correspondence with my grandfather. The crowd became completely silent again. Richard looked genuinely surprised. I forgot about that. My stomach tightened. Nobody had mentioned direct correspondence before. Mark carefully read the note. According to the report, My grandfather had agreed to postpone negotiations temporarily after receiving assurances that future reviews would continue and long-term planning would be addressed. Several residents looked stunned. The recommendation had not been rejected. It had been delayed. That changed everything. The entire situation suddenly felt larger, more deliberate, more complicated. The construction site, the lease, the missed reviews, the missing attachment, all of it seemed connected now. Then Richard reached into the briefcase one final time and removed a sealed envelope with my grandfather's name written across the front. The sealed envelope sat on the hood of my truck while everyone stared at it. Nobody spoke. The afternoon sun reflected off the windshield and cast a bright strip of light across the paper. My grandfather's name was written in blue ink across the front. The handwriting looked old, deliberate, familiar. Richard rested one hand on the briefcase and looked at me. He gave me this years ago. The crowd became even quieter. Karen looked away. Mark folded his arms. The older resident stepped closer. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. I carefully picked up the envelope. The paper felt brittle. One corner had yellowed with age. A small crease ran across the back flap. It had never been opened. At least not by me. Another hook. Why did he give it to you? I asked. Richard exhaled slowly. He said to keep it unless the lease ever became a problem. Several residents exchanged stunned looks. That sentence landed hard. The lease had become a problem. A very public problem. I opened the flap carefully. The paper inside slid out with a soft rustling sound. More than one page. 3 pages. The first sheet was a letter. The second contained notes. The third appeared to be a copy of correspondence. I started reading. The crowd waited. Wind moved through the nearby trees. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a garage door opened and closed. Everything else felt still. The first paragraph immediately caught my attention. My grandfather described meetings with representatives from the HOA years earlier. He wrote that he had agreed to postpone discussions because he believed future boards would honor the review process outlined in the lease. Several residents lowered their heads. Others looked directly at Karen. Nobody interrupted. I continued reading. The letter described concerns about long-term planning, concerns about ignoring lease obligations, concerns about leadership, assuming the issue would eventually disappear. Richard nodded slowly while I read. He had clearly seen some of this before. The older resident looked troubled. He predicted this, he asked quietly. I continued reading. The next paragraph was even more direct. My grandfather wrote that land ownership never changes simply because people stop talking about it. The crowd reacted immediately. A few people whispered. Others remained silent. The sentence carried weight. Not because it was dramatic, because it was true. Mark asked to see the second page. I handed it to him. His eyes moved quickly across the notes. Then he stopped. Ethan. The way he said my name caught my attention immediately. Another hook. He pointed to a handwritten section near the bottom. The notes referenced future market adjustment calculations. Specific calculations. Detailed calculations. Not guesses. Not rough estimates. Actual projections. Residents leaned closer again. Mark carefully reviewed the figures. Then he looked up. Your grandfather expected the lease value to increase substantially over time. The older resident frowned. How substantially? Mark ran through the numbers. Even adjusted conservatively, the difference between the current rate and projected market value was enormous. The crowd reacted instantly. Conversations erupted around us. People started doing their own math. Some opened calculators on their phones. Others looked stunned. Karen finally stepped forward. Those are only projections. Her voice sounded strained. Not angry. Strained. Residents immediately challenged her. Questions came from every direction. Had the board known? Had attorneys reviewed this? Were reserve funds ever discussed? Why had homeowners never been informed? Karen tried answering several questions. None of the answers slowed the momentum. The documents had become too specific, too detailed, too difficult to dismiss. Mark then examined the final page from the envelope. His expression changed again. I noticed immediately. Richard noticed too. Mark handed the page to me. Attached to the correspondence was a summary from an attorney who had reviewed the lease years earlier. One sentence had been underlined. Twice. I read it slowly. Then I read it again. The attorney warned that failure to address future reviews could eventually create significant financial exposure for the HOA. The crowd fell silent. Every piece was starting to connect. The memorandum. The missed reviews. the reserve recommendation, the missing attachment, the letter, the projections. None of them stood alone anymore. Then Richard pointed toward a name at the bottom of the attorney summary, and suddenly Karen looked genuinely alarmed. Richard's finger rested beside the attorney's name at the bottom of the summary. Nobody spoke. The afternoon air felt heavier now. The crowd stood packed around my truck while sunlight reflected off the survey maps and old lease documents. I looked down at the signature. Then I looked at Karen. Her reaction confirmed she recognized it immediately. The attorney who wrote the warning was not some distant consultant nobody remembered. He had remained connected to the community for years. Several residents recognized the name too. The older resident was the first to speak. He advised later boards as well. Richard nodded slowly. A ripple moved through the crowd. That detail changed everything. The warning had not vanished into history. It had remained within reach the entire time. Karen opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For once, she seemed unsure which explanation to choose. Another hook. Mark carefully reviewed the attorney summary again. He pointed to a date near the bottom. This review happened after the lease concerns were already documented. Residents immediately understood the significance. The warning came after concerns had been raised, after discussions had occurred, after recommendations had been proposed. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. A woman standing near the sidewalk looked at Karen. So multiple people knew there was a problem? Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became an answer. Wind pushed across the parking lot. A loose sheet slid several inches across the truck hood before I caught it. The smell of warm asphalt drifted from the entrance road. Across the neighborhood, several homeowners were now walking toward the crowd after hearing rumors about what was happening. Every few minutes more people arrived. The gathering had become too large to dismiss. Richard opened another folder from the briefcase. He searched through several pages and removed a document protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. His movements were careful, deliberate, like someone handling evidence rather than paperwork. He placed the sleeve beside the attorney summary. This was prepared for a board workshop. The heading immediately drew attention. Long-term lease planning. Several residents leaned closer. Karen looked away. I noticed that too. Mark read through the first page. Then he quietly handed it to me. The workshop document contained projected scenarios, different financial models, different renewal outcomes, different strategies. The numbers varied, but the conclusion remained consistent. Future lease adjustments needed preparation. Without preparation, homeowners could eventually face significant costs. The crowd reacted instantly. Some residents looked frustrated. Others looked disappointed. A few seemed genuinely betrayed. The older resident rubbed his forehead. We should have known about this. Richard nodded. That was my position at the time. Another crack. Another shift. The discussion was no longer about whether warnings existed. The documents had settled that question. The discussion had moved to what happened after the warnings were received. Mark turned several pages deeper into the workshop packet. His finger stopped suddenly. I saw it before he spoke. Another clue. Another missing piece. Attached near the back was a meeting attendance sheet. Names filled most of the page. Board members, advisors, community representatives. Several signatures matched names already appearing throughout the records. Then Mark pointed to one signature near the bottom. The crowd leaned closer. Karen immediately stiffened. The signature belonged to someone still serving the HOA. Not a former board member. Not a retired advisor. A current leader. Residents recognized the name instantly. Conversations erupted around us. Questions spread through the crowd faster than before. Who else knew? What records still existed? Were additional documents stored somewhere? Karen tried to regain control. She called for an official meeting. She suggested waiting for legal review. She urged residents not to jump to conclusions. But the momentum had shifted beyond her reach. People wanted answers now. Not next month. Not after another committee review. Now. Mark carefully stacked the documents into neat piles. Richard closed part of the briefcase. The older resident looked toward the clubhouse. Then he looked back at me. You need to present all of this publicly. Several residents immediately agreed. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. The idea spread almost instantly. An open community meeting. Full disclosure. Every document on the table. Every question addressed. For the first time all day, Karen looked genuinely worried about what might happen next. Then someone from the crowd announced that tonight's board meeting was only 3 hours away. By the time the evening board meeting approached, the atmosphere across the neighborhood had completely changed. Residents who normally skipped meetings were showing up early. Cars lined both sides of the street near the clubhouse. The orange glow of sunset stretched across the parking lot, while conversations filled the air. Nobody was talking about landscaping projects or community events. Every discussion centered on the lease, the documents, and the questions that refused to disappear. I arrived carrying copies of the records Richard had brought from his briefcase. Mark walked beside me. The older resident followed close behind. Richard arrived a few minutes later carrying the original folders. The moment people saw the documents, another crowd formed. Karen stood near the clubhouse entrance, speaking with several board members. Her expression remained controlled, but the confidence she displayed that morning was gone. Another hook. Inside the meeting room, every chair filled quickly. Residents lined the walls. Some stood in the hallway. The low hum of conversation echoed through the building. The smell of coffee mixed with old carpet and paper. It felt less like a routine HOA meeting and more like a public hearing. Several board members exchanged nervous glances while waiting for the meeting to begin. At exactly 7 o'clock, Karen called the meeting to order. The room quieted immediately. She started with routine agenda items. Financial updates. Maintenance reports. Committee announcements. Nobody cared. The impatience in the room was obvious. Residents shifted in their seats. Several looked directly at the stack of documents sitting beside me. Finally, a homeowner stood up. "Can we discuss the lease?" Applause erupted across the room. Karen attempted to restore order. Then another resident stood. Then another. Within seconds, the entire meeting had shifted. The lease became the only topic anyone wanted to discuss. Karen realized resistance was pointless. She nodded toward me. "You may present your findings." The room became silent. I stood and walked to the front. The stack of documents suddenly felt heavier than before. I began with the survey, then the lease, then the review schedule, then the memorandum. I moved carefully through each piece. No accusations, no dramatic claims, just facts. The room listened closely. When I explained the missed review dates, several residents looked stunned. When I described the reserve fund recommendation, more heads turned toward the board. When Richard presented the workshop documents and attorney summary, the silence became almost uncomfortable. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The documents spoke for themselves. Another hook. Then Richard stood. The room immediately focused on him. He explained the history behind the records, the meetings, the discussions, the recommendations that never moved forward. He described his concerns years earlier and why he kept copies of important documents. Several residents took notes. Others simply listened. Then came the letter from my grandfather. I read several sections aloud. Not all of it, just enough. The words carried weight throughout the room, especially the passage about ownership never changing simply because people stopped discussing it. A few residents lowered their eyes. Others looked directly at the board table. The tension kept building. Then a homeowner raised an unexpected question. Did any board ever inform residents about these warnings? The room went silent again. Board members looked at one another. Nobody answered immediately. That hesitation became its own answer. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Karen attempted to respond, but before she could finish, Mark stood up. Everyone turned toward him. He held a single page from the workshop packet. "There is something else." The room froze. Mark pointed toward a section most people had overlooked. A follow-up review meeting had been scheduled years ago. Specific date, specific location, specific attendees. Several names appeared on the list. One name belonged to a current board member sitting in the room. The reaction was immediate. Faces turned toward the board table. Questions exploded across the clubhouse. Even Karen looked surprised. Then the board member slowly stood up and admitted he still had boxes of old HOA records stored in his garage. The room exploded with conversation the moment the board member admitted he still had boxes of old HOA records stored in his garage. People stood from their chairs. Questions came from every direction. Karen repeatedly asked for order, but the energy inside the clubhouse had shifted beyond anyone's control. The board member raised both hands. "I never thought any of it mattered anymore." That sentence echoed through the room. The older resident shook his head slowly. Mark remained standing near the front table. Richard sat quietly with the briefcase beside him. I watched the faces around the room. Residents were no longer looking for someone to blame. They were looking for the truth. Another hook. The board member explained that several boxes had been transferred between outgoing board members years ago. Meeting notes, correspondence, financial reports, archived files. Nothing had been organized. Nothing had been reviewed in years. He simply stored them. The admission created another wave of discussion. Then something unexpected happened. A resident stood and asked a simple question. Can we see them? Silence followed. The board member looked toward Karen. Karen looked toward the rest of the board. Nobody seemed prepared for that question. Finally, he nodded. Yes. The room erupted into applause. Not because anyone knew what was inside the boxes. Because transparency had finally entered the conversation. For the first time all evening, people felt like they were moving toward answers instead of away from them. Over the next hour, the meeting transformed completely. Residents voted to create an independent document review committee. Volunteers immediately stepped forward. Mark agreed to assist with records organization. Richard agreed to provide copies of everything from his briefcase. Several homeowners offered professional experience in accounting, legal administration, and archives management. The atmosphere changed from frustration to action. Then Karen stood. The room quieted once more. Her voice sounded different than it had that morning. Less defensive, more measured. She acknowledged that important information should have been shared more openly. She admitted that residents deserved a complete understanding of the lease situation. Nobody cheered. Nobody argued. People simply listened. The moment felt genuine. The older resident nodded once. That small gesture seemed important. The meeting eventually ended nearly 3 hours after it began. Residents remained in the parking lot long afterward. Small groups formed beneath the parking lot lights. Conversations continued beside cars and sidewalks. The air had cooled. Crickets filled the spaces between voices. I stood near my truck looking back at the clubhouse. The stack of documents sat beside me. The lease, the reviews, the memorandum, the missing attachment, my grandfather's letter. All of it had started with land I inherited and questions nobody expected to ask. Richard walked over carrying his briefcase. Your grandfather would have appreciated tonight. I looked toward the clubhouse entrance. Residents were still talking, still sharing ideas, still searching for answers. I think he would have wanted this resolved, I said. Richard smiled. That too. A week later, the first document review session took place. More records surfaced. More questions were answered. The missing pieces slowly connected. The community finally began addressing issues that had been postponed for years. There were no dramatic courtroom moments. No overnight miracles. Just facts, records, conversations, and accountability. Sometimes that is how real justice works. Patient, steady, unavoidable. The construction project eventually resumed with proper review. The lease discussions moved forward openly. Residents stayed informed. Most importantly, nobody could pretend the documents did not exist anymore. As for me, I never set out to challenge an HOA. I inherited land. Then I followed the paperwork. The paperwork did the rest. And every time I drive past that neighborhood now, I remember the moment a forgotten box of records changed everything.